The message was simple. We're leaving. You're staying. But the meaning was devastating. I could have screamed. I could have begged. Instead, I erased every connection. By the time they understood, my life was mine, a storm of their own making. I woke up before sunrise, the familiar chill of the bedroom reminding me that summer mornings in Allentown carried a quiet edge even before the sun broke the horizon. My boots sat neatly by the door, worn and scuffed from years of early mornings and steady labor. The phone on the nightstand buzzed, slicing through the silence with the authority of a small, sharp alarm. I picked it up, expecting a note about a scheduled change at the plant or a weather alert. Instead, I read the words from Carrie, words that shifted the ground beneath me in a single line. She and the kids were leaving for the East Coast. I was staying home. My eyes traced the sentence several times, as if the letters might rearrange themselves, might make sense in a way my mind could tolerate. Each reading confirmed the same brutal truth. I had been excluded from plans I had helped create, paid for, and anticipated for months. The coffee maker whirred softly in the kitchen, red light blinking, a steady heartbeat in the quiet apartment. I moved methodically, pouring the hot liquid into my thermos, tightening the lid, letting the warmth seep into my hands, as if it could anchor me against the sudden displacement of expectation and routine. I pulled my bills and my calendar from the drawers, noticing the small marks I had made months ago, circling dates and jotting down expenses, calculating overtime shifts to cover flights and hotels. Every action a promise I had made to keep the family's life moving forward. Now all of that work, every careful calculation, seemed invisible, disregarded, as if it had never existed. The silence of the apartment pressed against me, amplified by the absence of the children's laughter and Carrie's presence. The quiet was too complete, suffocating yet clarifying. My mind began to count, to catalog. Each payment I had made alone, each bill carried by my account, each effort unacknowledged. A pattern emerged from the chaos, precise and cold. For the first time that morning, I felt clarity, an unyielding recognition that the life I had maintained for years had been treated as a background, a resource to be drawn upon and set aside without notice. I did not panic. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply observed, measured, and understood that the day had shifted, that I had been handed a stark choice by circumstances I had never anticipated. The machinery of the plant, the rhythm of my shifts, the life I had built in small increments of time and effort, all felt suddenly mine in a way they had never been before. I would not react out of anger, but I would act. I would reclaim the agency that had been silently eroded over years of compliance and goodwill. That morning, standing at the kitchen table with thermos in hand, bills spread across the surface, and the quiet of my empty apartment surrounding me, I realized that what had begun as a small disruption would become the first step toward redefining everything I had thought I knew about my place in the world. I sat down at the kitchen table, the morning light cutting through the blinds in narrow, precise lines across the surface. My laptop glowed softly in front of me, emails and bank statements spread across the screen, each number a record of years I had spent building stability for a life that now felt like a shadow. 10 years of shared existence, meticulously recorded in spreadsheets, receipts, and digital folders, every payment categorized, every withdrawal traced back to me. Rent, utilities, groceries, car insurance, phone plans, school supplies, birthday parties, weekend outings. All of it flowed from my accounts, funded by my overtime and careful budgeting. The realization that nearly everything had been borne by my effort alone settled over me with a quiet weight. Carrie had relied on me without acknowledgement, her assumption that I would continue to provide forming the invisible scaffolding of our family life while leaving me unseen. I opened a fresh document and began to write, listing 45 recurring payments, each item a thread in the network I had held together for a decade. Each line on the page sharpened my focus, distilled my anger into clarity, made tangible the invisible labor I had sustained. I did not pause for resentment, did not linger on disappointment. Instead, I moved systematically, deciding to sever the automatic ties that had bound my resources to a family that had stopped recognizing my presence. First came the credit cards, authorized users removed, my name alone remaining on each account. The digital confirmations arrived quietly, silently marking the separation of financial bonds that had once been assumed eternal. Next came streaming services, subscriptions that had been shared but paid for solely by me. Each cancellation was deliberate, deliberate in its timing, deliberate in its precision, like turning gears in a mechanism I had built without protest for years. Then the phone lines, 3 of them under my name, were closed to independent management, the accounts now requiring their own responsibility. Insurance policies followed, car coverage transferred or terminated, every action executed with a steady hand, every step documented in a journal I kept for the clarity it provided. I moved through the morning like a craftsman, each action deliberate, unhurried, a reflection of an internal discipline that had grown from years of measured endurance. The process was not cruel, not vengeful, but absolute. By the time the sun had fully climbed over the rooftops, 45 payments had been evaluated, canceled, or reassigned, leaving only the essentials I used personally. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted in a way that came from sustained mental focus rather than physical labor, and felt the first real sense of control I had. The house was still, the coffee long gone cold, the accounts empty of obligations that were no longer mine to carry. For the first time, I understood the weight of autonomy, the power of a life unshared financially with those who had long taken it for granted. Every action, every cancellation, every transfer had been methodical, precise, and deliberate, creating a quiet but undeniable shift in the center of my life. The calculations were not about revenge. They were about clarity, about reclaiming what had always been mine, asserting the boundaries that had been ignored for a decade. I reviewed the lease for the apartment, the document crisp in my hands, every signature and initial a record of obligations that had long been mine alone. My name was the only one on the paperwork, the sole responsibility resting on my shoulders, and it struck me how invisible that responsibility had been to everyone else. I checked the utility accounts, the electric, water, and gas, each one tied exclusively to me, each one a silent testament to years of unnoticed labor. The car insurance policies followed the same pattern, coverage entirely my responsibility, payments drawn automatically from my accounts without comment or recognition. I contacted the property management company, arranged for an official termination of the lease, and set in motion the move to a small room in a neighboring town, a space that would contain only what I truly owned and truly needed. I began packing slowly, deliberately, taking only what was essential: a modest wardrobe, tools I used for work, a few books that I returned to again and again for comfort or insight, a handful of photographs capturing fragments of my past, images of a life I had participated in but never fully inhabited. Everything else remained behind: furniture, decorations, possessions acquired for family life, objects once cherished, but now simply remnants of a chapter that no longer belonged to me. The act of leaving became symbolic, the physical removal of items echoing the emotional severance I had begun weeks ago. With each box loaded, each drawer emptied, I felt a shift, subtle at first, then undeniable, as if the walls of the apartment had absorbed the tension and resentment of years spent in unnoticed sacrifice. Standing in the empty rooms, I could see the outlines of a life I had sustained for others, and for the first time, the weight of expectation was gone. I carried only what I had claimed as mine, and in that minimalism, there was a clarity I had never experienced before. Every step of the move was methodical, precise, a ritual of reclamation. I filed the final documents, disconnected the remaining services, and walked through the apartment one last time, observing the emptiness not with sadness, but with a strange sense of liberation. The old connections, the unbalanced dependencies, had been severed. I was no longer merely the foundation others leaned on, unseen and assumed. I had dismantled the framework that had defined my existence and in its place found the first outlines of autonomy. The drive to the neighboring town was quiet, the road unfolding in a series of turns and straight stretches, each mile bringing me further from the life that had consumed me and closer to a version of myself I had long denied. The small room awaited, sparse and unadorned, but entirely mine, a space where decisions, actions, and priorities would belong only to me. In the silence of that room, as I arranged my few belongings, I felt the contours of freedom taking shape, subtle yet undeniable. a new foundation for a life rebuilt on the terms I had finally set for myself. I settled into the small room above the shop, the narrow space quickly taking on a quiet familiarity. The bed was modest, the dresser worn but functional, the table by the window a place where I could organize my papers, write notes, or simply watch the street below. The kitchenette was small, a single burner and a compact refrigerator. Enough for simple meals prepared quickly and eaten deliberately, a stark contrast to years spent cooking for others, managing their tastes and schedules. The window became my anchor, a lens through which I observed the rhythms of the town. Neighbors leaving for work, children biking along the sidewalks, deliveries being made to the shop below. Everything happened outside, yet it belonged to me to notice, unshared, unjudged. Mornings fell into a predictable pattern, waking early, walking to the factory, clocking in, performing work that required steady hands and attention but left the mind free to reflect. Lunch was quiet, often at a small diner near the factory. The same seat week after week, the routine grounding me in a life that demanded nothing beyond my own presence. Evenings were spent returning to the room, cooking a modest dinner, perhaps reading or arranging my belongings. The simplicity of these rituals, stripped of obligation to others, became a balm. Each small task, each intentional choice, reinforced a sense of control I had never possessed before. I maintained a quiet observation of the people around me, learning their rhythms, their habits, the patterns of small-town life. Colleagues at the factory were polite but distant, conversations limited to the weather or machines. No probing into my past, no assumptions about my future. This anonymity became a form of protection, a space where my decisions and my energy belonged solely to me. Freedom was subtle at first, a gentle unburdening, but it grew more tangible with each passing day. Each moment I chose my own priorities. I found satisfaction in small accomplishments, the consistency of a workday, the completion of simple chores, the preparation of meals that no one demanded. There was a clarity in the repetition, a rhythm that replaced the chaos of dependence with the quiet assertion of self. The room, the routines, the streets I walked, and the sights I observed became a framework for a life rebuilt on choice rather than obligation. Time no longer passed under the weight of expectations. It moved under the weight of my own decisions, measured in work shifts, cups of coffee, pages read, and meals eaten in silence. As weeks passed, I noticed a shift in myself. The edge of resentment dulled, replaced by a calm attentiveness to the world around me. I could watch others living their lives without being pulled into their drama, a neutral observer with agency, no longer responsible for the invisible labor of others. Even the simplest pleasures, a sunrise caught on the walk to the factory, a breeze through the open window, the quiet hum of the shop below, felt like rewards for reclaiming time and space that had long been claimed by others. I was building a life that answered only to me, a foundation of small, deliberate choices, each one reinforcing a sense of internal sovereignty I had never truly experienced before. Weeks passed, and I began to notice the ripples of my decisions reaching back to the life I had left behind. Social media updates and occasional messages painted a picture of struggle and disruption. The apartment they moved into was cramped. Rent payments were stretching tight budgets, and the children juggled responsibilities that had once been handled without question. The absence of the biological father became clear as his presence remained sporadic and unreliable, leaving gaps of responsibility no one could fill. I observed it all quietly. The detachment a conscious choice, a deliberate boundary that protected the life I was carefully reconstructing. Each update, each fragment of information, reinforced a sense of clarity and control I had not felt in years. I felt no need to intervene, no impulse to provide financial support or step back into roles I had abandoned. The tension between what I had once carried and what I now allowed to unfold without my involvement became a kind of revelation, a proof of the independence I had claimed. I realized the invisible labor I had performed for a decade had been immense, yet unrecognized, and the autonomy I now preserved was worth far more than temporary appeasement. Watching the consequences unfold without interference revealed something deeper about the patterns I had lived under. I saw how easy it had been for others to rely on me while dismissing my own needs, how every act of support had reinforced an unbalanced structure in which I had been the sole foundation. By stepping away, by refusing to prop up a system that had never acknowledged me, I experienced a newfound sense of equilibrium. Each day I chose to maintain distance, each decision to let the past unfold without my correction, strengthened the architecture of the life I was building. The realization was not sudden or dramatic, but slow and steady, like a tide pulling clarity into focus. I understood that independence was not only freedom from obligation, but also freedom to define what mattered, to prioritize a life that answered only to my own rhythms. Responsibility no longer felt like a trap. It became a series of deliberate choices within the bounds I had set. My perception of time shifted, my attention narrowed to the tangible, the controllable, the meaningful tasks that affirmed my autonomy. With each update from the past, I felt less burdened and more grounded. The chaos I had once absorbed on behalf of others now belonged entirely to them. My internal space was cleared, my routines and surroundings unencumbered, allowing me to inhabit a life entirely my own. The knowledge that I could witness struggle without being consumed by it, that I could maintain empathy without surrendering control, became an unspoken foundation. For the first time, I experienced the full measure of a life lived on my own terms, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that stepping back had been not abandonment but reclamation. 3 months had passed since I had stepped away from the life that had consumed me for so long. Each morning I rose with a quiet certainty, the alarm pulling me from sleep without the dread that had once accompanied it. My routine was simple, deliberate, and entirely mine. I dressed for the factory, packed a modest lunch, and walked the short distance to Bishop Manufacturing, the hum of machinery greeting me like an old, impartial companion. Work was steady and predictable, each shift offering the satisfaction of labor completed and wages earned without strings attached. My room above the small store became more than shelter. It became a sanctuary. The small bed, narrow dresser, and table by the window framed a space that belonged entirely to me. I arranged my few possessions carefully, folding clothes and placing books in neat stacks, letting go of unnecessary clutter and memories that had tethered me to a life that was no longer mine. Each evening, I prepared simple meals for myself, rice and vegetables, chicken or eggs, mindful in the act of nourishment, conscious of the rhythm and autonomy it represented. I revisited old photographs only once, scrolling through years of holidays, birthdays, and vacations where I had been present but invisible, always supporting, always overlooked. I deleted nearly all of them, erasing the tangible reminders of a life that had demanded my energy without acknowledgement. One screenshot remained, the single message that had started everything. The text that told me I was to stay home while they went on the trip. It was no longer a wound, but a marker, a symbol of the precise moment when my life shifted entirely into my own hands. Days passed with steady cadence. I walked to the diner across from my room, learned to enjoy the quiet mornings, and nodded to familiar faces without explanation. I purchased a used truck that smelled faintly of pine air freshener, a reliable vehicle that required only my care. I began to understand the satisfaction in predictability, the comfort in self-directed routines, and the freedom that came from shedding expectations that had never been mine. Each evening, I sat by the window, listening to the town settle into quiet. The distant bark of a dog, the hum of a streetlight, the occasional laugh or conversation on the sidewalk, all became part of a peaceful backdrop that reflected the internal calm I had cultivated. I felt no bitterness, no need for confrontation, only the steady, grounding presence of my own life unfolding under my control. In this rhythm, I discovered discipline not as obligation, but as a framework for freedom. Each choice, from finances to meals to the hours of work, reinforced a life constructed entirely on my terms. The past no longer dictated my present. The future was a blank page I could fill at will. I had built a foundation of stability and self-respect, and in it, I found quiet joy in the small, deliberate acts of living. The new routine was not confinement, but liberation, a measure of the independence I had long sought, a life in which no one else could determine my value or claim authority over my days.